Recording in progress.
Okay, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you to everyone for joining us for tonight's lecture. We do have some sign-in sheets, so if you haven't checked yourself off, if you could check yourself off afterwards. Tonight's presentation is part of our Great Decisions discussion group. I know many of you are participating right now. We're about halfway through. It's a program that's sponsored by the Foreign Policy Association, and it has 9 different topics of global interest. And we meet right in this room here to discuss the topics. And then some of the topics, thanks to Paul's help, we have accompanying lectures. So it is continuing through, likely through the end of June. So if it's something that you're interested in, you can sign up on our website.
Where do I get one of those booklets?
That is a trick question. So we do thank the Connecticut Humanities for their generous support, which is enabling us to provide the program and to provide the briefing books. However, it's been so popular that we've actually given out all of our grant-funded briefing books. We do have a couple of circulating copies here at the library, and I'm reaching out to a few folks who haven't actually picked up their books to see if perhaps they don't plan to participate. So we're kind of queuing up people to join us, but we can make it work we're about halfway through, so we can figure out a way to get you the information if you do decide you want to join the group.
Thank you.
Thanks. And just a reminder for those in Great Decisions, we will be meeting here next week to discuss Chapter 7 in the book, which is industrial policy. And tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce our partner on the Great Decisions program that we're offering. Paul Nugent is the Executive Director of the Southeast Connecticut World Affairs Council. And I had reached out to Paul, I don't know, about 6 months ago at this point, to see if he and his organizations would be interested in partnering with the Waterford Public Library to offer this program. I was applying for a grant through Connecticut Humanities, and thankfully he decided that it sounded like a good idea for his organization as well. And that's what brings us here this evening. So Paul was born and raised in Ireland, and after receiving a PhD at the University College in Dublin, he came to Philadelphia to study cell and molecular biology, and then on to the University of Louisville to study birth defects. Paul joined Pfizer in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 2002, and he relocated with Pfizer to Southeast Connecticut, which is our gain, thank you, in 2008. So Paul now lives in Old Saybrook, and he has a keen interest in international affairs, diplomatic history, and Irish history. And today he's going to be talking to us more about Ireland's present times and the impact of Brexit on Ireland. So thank you, Paul.
So thanks very much, Chris. And actually, when Chris came to me with this idea, I was delighted, because the Great Decisions program is done by many World Affairs Council chapters across the US, and we just never got around to doing it purely because of bandwidth. And that gives me an opportunity to say something about SECWAC. But this is the title of my presentation this evening, the bulk of it. All changed utterly. Those of you who know poetry will see a little Yeats in that. The impact of Brexit on Ireland. I'm going to talk
1916.
a little about Brexit, but I'm not an economist, so mostly about the impact on Ireland. Whoops. So this is the Southeast Connecticut World Affairs Council. You can get us at SECWAC.org, bringing the world to Southeast Connecticut and bringing Southeast Connecticut to the world. And how we do that, I should say we're a chapter of the World Affairs Council of America, and there's 80 or 90 chapters across the country. Some of them are relatively small, like ours. We've about 180 members. It's an all-volunteer board and organizers. And some of them, like the Philadelphia one, have a multi-million-dollar budget. So it depends on where you are. But but you have one locally, and please contact us if you're interested. I just want to give you an idea of some of the speakers we've had in the past. Roughly every month we have a speaker, sometimes twice a month, between September and June. So we're almost through our current season. And people in the past, we've had George Packer from the New Yorker on a biography of Holbrook, Peter Baker, Fiona Hill, you'll remember from turning up in a very famous event a few years ago. In fact, last night we had Elbridge Colby on US national security, re-China. And most of our meetings are Zoom, of course, over the last 2 years. We had a meeting last week, actually, I should have put that in, my slide's a little out of date, on Ukraine. Marcy Shore from Yale came and spoke to us, and that was hybrid. We met at the Congregational Church in Old Lyme. We had about 30 people in the room and about 30 people Zooming in. So I guess the lesson is hybrid is the way of the future. Our next meeting, will be in May. We'll have actually local and SECWAC member Rolf Volkswinkel from NYU. He's a world expert on Anne Frank and on the Holocaust, and he's going to speak on the recent developments in that case. And I'm actually planning a panel discussion for the fall on Afghanistan and Iraq and what went right and what went wrong. So please check out secwac.org. These cards are over there. You can check out the meetings we've planned for this quarter, I think it is. Yeah. Okay. So, so as Chris said, this is really part of the Great Decisions program, although I'm cheating a little because Brexit was not in the booklet for 2022, but it was in the booklet for 2021. So, and this was the booklet. We weren't doing it at the time, unfortunately, but I can, it was covered. So what I want to do this evening is help you to understand the impact of Brexit on Ireland, but in the context of the past century of Anglo-Irish relations, and just as importantly, recent developments in Ireland over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years or thereabouts. And I'm going to cover a few important topics. The partition of Ireland in the early 1920s, you'll hear more about that. I'm going to refer to the Troubles in Northern Ireland between 1968 and 1998. The development of Anglo-Irish relations with respect to the European Union, how Britain and Ireland both joined the European Union in 1973 at the same time. Modernization of Ireland is really fascinating, and I'm going to refer later to a new book out by Irish journalist Fintan O'Toole. He writes for the Irish Times. He's a bit of a Renaissance man. He teaches a semester at Princeton University. He's a James Joyce expert. The man is a genius, but he's brought out a new book, and I'll talk more about it later, called We Didn't Know Ourselves, which is a very Irish expression. And he literally looks at born the same year as me, he looks at the last 60 odd years of Irish history and is sort of a memoir of his own family as well, but integrates the two brilliantly. I'm actually doing the audio version at the moment. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the importance of the Irish American lobby, and you'll see why that is important later. So first of all, place names, just to orient ourselves. So this is the northeast corner of Ireland. This is the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. The whole thing is called by some people the British Isles. This is Britain, Scotland, England, and Wales. And this is the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And before 1922, it is, of course, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And I'll speak more to that later. So a very brief summary of what happened with Brexit. So June 2016, really in an effort by the Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, to silence certain anti-European Union elements within his own party, he, somewhat rashly perhaps, said, we'll do a referendum. And of course, he thought it would be soundly defeated. It was very poorly run in a way, in the sense that there was not a whole lot of debate beforehand. And actually, I'm just going to quote the last paragraph in the Brexit article in this book, which I think is interesting to this point. It says, politicians who told people what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to hear failed the test of leadership. the full consequences of their failure will be felt for years to come. And that's definitely a theme of the Brexit referendum. It was very poorly, it was very poor. There was a lot of emotional stuff in the run up to the referendum. There were no important issues discussed, such as, okay, if we vote for it, how will it happen? And there was a lot of stuff about anti-immigrant sentiment, and I don't have time to get into that in detail, but basically, Cameron thought it would be defeated. It wasn't. Remarkably, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and London voted to remain with Europe, but the most of England and Wales voted for Brexit, and it was a pretty slim margin, 52% to 48%, out of a total 70% population voting, which is actually a pretty good turnout. If you've got 70% voting in an American general election, or presidential election, we'd be pretty happy. Unfortunately, though, it could have been 50% plus one person would have carried Brexit, and that was probably a mistake. They should have, because it was such an important item. I will tell you also that this is quite a good article, because there's a little piece about it here in the article. It says, at about 1 a.m. Eastern, so Google reported sharp uptick in searches about the European Union on the day of the referendum. So people were Googling, what is the European Union exactly? And it says, at about 1 a.m. Eastern time, about 8 hours after the polls closed in Britain, Google reported that searches for what happens if we leave the EU had more than tripled. Testament to how little preparation was done at the time. And this just shows you down here, the vast majority in England and Wales voting, but Scotland and importantly, Northern Ireland voted to remain in Europe. But because the majority voted to Brexit, Brexit is what you got. So this is more to show you the tortuous route from 2016 to, well, I have it to February 2022. We don't need to go through all the steps. I'd rather not. I do want to point out that two prime ministers have fallen on the Brexit sword. David Cameron, of course, who called the referendum, resigned immediately. And then Theresa May, who took over, resigned in 2019. And of course, I was going to say we got, but no, they got Boris Johnson. With a sizable majority in the following general election, and that is not unimportant. So, for the purposes of this evening, a key issue falling out of the referendum was the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland as the only land border between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and that's significant. And there were two goals of the European Union and Ireland in the subsequent negotiations. So once Brexit was declared to happen, then it had to be decided, well, how will it happen? How will this be executed? And two goals of Ireland and the European Union was to protect the EU single market. So there's a great benefit to being in a single market, reduced trade barriers effectively. And I'm not an economist, but you can imagine that sort of thing. It's kind of like trading within the US. If we had borders between the states, as perhaps some people would like, we wouldn't have as good a trade. And then to avoid a hard border in Ireland, I'll speak more to that as we get into talk about the Troubles. But to make this thing happen, and it's a long, tortuous story, as I said, they come up with something called the Northern Ireland Protocol, the NIP. And the idea of this, and this is what, and this is important, this is what the British agreed to with the European Union. They agreed to implement this protocol, and it would mean that there would be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, this border here. Now, in a sense, that was kind of silly, because there had to be some kind of a border for commercial purposes, because this is between two vastly different jurisdictions. However, the concern, I think, was, and this is where the Irish government was involved, and the Europeans supported Ireland on that. The concern was that setting up border posts again would harken back to the Troubles of 30 years ago and potentially precipitate trouble again. This idea was consistent and supporting the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, which was the agreement between Britain and Ireland to end the Troubles that everybody bought into, and was a major success of US diplomacy, with George Mitchell leading the charge on that. And it also speaks to the Irish efforts to Europeanize the border. And what I mean by that is, when I was growing up in Ireland back in the bad old days in the last century, and even during the Troubles, and even into the past, probably 1998, there was always a sense that the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland was an internal matter for Britain and for Ireland. Ireland's efforts, Ireland is now trying to make that a more of a European idea and to gain some support for our agenda in that. So there's a few key events in 2019 and 2020. So there was a UK election in 2019, and this the blue are the Conservatives and Reds Labour, and you can see there was, you don't need to see the numbers, there was a substantial increase in the number of Conservative MPs and a dramatic reduction in Labour MPs, and the example they talk about the red wall in the north of England. So the north of England generally has been a major Labour supporting area. It's the parts of England traditionally associated with the working class, with the mines, with factories, and Labour has always held those, and Labour took a thorough drubbing in that election, and that's why Boris Johnson ended up with such a huge majority in the Parliament. And interestingly, that matters even today, which I'll try to get to later. There was also an election in the Republic of Ireland in 2020, and without getting into too much detail about parties, political parties in Ireland, since independence, there's been basically two main parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They're both sort of centre-right, and they have swapped back and forth as to who'd be in power. A Labour Party was not very powerful. Sometimes it would try to go into coalition to get some power. But the party called Sinn Féin, which was founded in the early 20th century and was instrumental in leading the effort towards Irish independence, but was significantly involved and considered to be the political wing of the Irish Republican Army during the Troubles. It has gained tremendous support in Ireland now, and it's quite remarkable. Now, I think it's fair to say that their position on Northern Ireland is, they're not saying much. Well, they want a united Ireland, but they're mostly focused on unemployment and the cost of housing in Ireland, especially in Dublin, which is gonna run away with itself. And they've actually got a lot of the young vote, and older folks like me say, well, but you know where Sinn Féin came from. And young people say, that's all in the past, we don't care. If Sinn Féin will control rents and house prices in Dublin and give us all a better chance, we'll vote for that. Remains to be seen. Importantly, Sinn Féin got a huge boost in 2021. There was a recent poll in the Irish Times which indicated that they lost a little bit of that boost here, down a few percent. But it's very possible that in the next general election in Ireland in 2025, Sinn Féin may emerge as the leading party. And in fact, the only reason they're not there now is because the other two parties, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, actually went into coalition to prevent Sinn Féin from, neither of them had enough majority to do it themselves. So remarkably, these two parties, who are adamantly opposed to each other, in fact, their origins are in the Irish Civil War of all things, and I'll get to that later maybe, but they're really both centre-right liberal democratic parties. They've actually joined in coalition. What else can I say about this? So another interesting part is, of course, the impact of COVID on the COVID pandemic. So in terms of the logistics of Brexit implementation, they've been hampered by COVID, if nothing else than the people getting together in Brussels and in London to negotiate the details. trying to distinguish the economic effects of Brexit and COVID on Brexit is tricky. And there's no doubt there's an exacerbation of the impact of Brexit. And I'm going to speak a little also to Boris Johnson's efforts to trying to reverse or to change the agreement on which Brexit was done, the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol, the NIP. This just points out some of the interesting economic impacts in 2021 of Brexit. So a shortage of truck drivers, gasoline supplies were in short supply. This slide was really made last fall and coming up to Christmas. Evidence of empty grocery shelves, concerns about Christmas shopping experience, shows us all where our hearts are when it comes to economics and social life, and traffic jams in Kent. And if you Google, because of course Kent is where Dover is where the transport goes to Europe, and Twitter is jumping every day with videos of colossal lines of trucks and cars in Kent. Interestingly, what's happened to trade is there's been a decrease in trade between Britain and Ireland, not surprising, but quite an increase in trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And this is very interesting because it speaks to the growth of an all-island trade, which actually a lot of conservatives in Britain and people in Northern Ireland who want to remain part of the United Kingdom resent and don't like, because they don't want to see that connection between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But and I don't have, unfortunately, his name, but a leader of a trade organization commented in the Irish Times in 2021, trade is like water, it will find the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is literally to go around Britain. And in fact, in October 11th of 2021, there was a new Ireland port opened out of all places, Dunkirk, to basically welcome ferry ships coming from Ireland straight around. So rather than going through England, they're coming around this way. And then, so this is a slide from the Financial Times showing UK exports underperforming in the rest of the world. So this is the UK. I think, yeah, this is the world in general, and I can't see that one. Oh, advanced economies, and you can see after in COVID a spike after we managed to get the pandemic under some sort of control, but it's been oscillating down at a much lower level in Britain. And that's from the Financial Times, and the quote is by Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics at King's College. So he ain't no Sinn Féiner. This is no Irishman speaking ill of the British economy. This is the way it is. So now on to the efforts to renegotiate by the United Kingdom government to renegotiate the Northern Ireland Protocol. So basically, they now consider that the trade arrangements between Great Britain and Northern Ireland are unacceptable. And the reason, so what's happened there was the agreement was that there would have to be checks on goods traveling between Northern Ireland and mainland Britain, rather than between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And of course, what that has effectively meant is a somewhat sundering of the connection between Northern Ireland and mainland Britain. And there is an Article 16 in the Northern Ireland Protocol, an option to take unilateral action if implementation leads to unintended outcomes that present significant challenges. So that's one of those legal wordings in the agreement. And now the British are threatening to do this. If they were to trigger Article 16, it would make the full implementation of Brexit very difficult. Ongoing negotiations, there are ongoing negotiations to ease custom checks to make it less onerous on goods staying in Northern Ireland, but to maintain the integrity of the single market. And this slide, these two pictures show David Frost, the former now British chief Brexit negotiator. He resigned end of last year, beginning of this year, and was taken. His position was taken by Liz Truss, who's the I think effectively the Secretary of State. I think she's the Foreign Secretary. And this is Maroš Šefčovič, who is the European Commissioner, a Pole, representing the European Union in these negotiations. So actually, Frost is another victim of Brexit. So this is a comment by Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission. The Brexit agreement was written in English so they could understand it. Somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Her English is very good, of course. So the difficulties that the Johnson administration have happened in Northern Ireland in the last couple of years. So I mentioned the resignation of David Frost, and that was because of his perception. He's a pretty hardcore Brexiteer, fairly right of centre, and he believes that the government has failed to make progress in a post-Brexit agenda. The resignation of the press officer, Allegra Stratton, you may have seen that. She was caught on video practicing how to answer press questions about what they're calling Partygate, which are the various events that happened at Downing Street and other government events during the pandemic. And she was asked, she was working with her colleagues. It's remarkable how people video these things. They were practicing how to answer, and the question was something like, was there a party? And she was laughing, and anyway, she had to go. It was easy to cast her aside. And of course, these breaches in COVID restrictions at 10 Downing Street have now finally made it to, they were investigated by the police, and now remarkably, the Prime Minister was issued basically a ticket for partying at a time when he had told the rest of the English people that they have to stay home and not mix, and of course, Johnson, being a remarkable individual he is, claimed that it was a work event. And there's all sorts of stories about suitcases full of wine bottles being brought into Downing Street. But as silly as all that is, and to be honest, really, what the British Prime Minister does really is of no concern to me. It's when the British Prime Minister does things that affect Ireland that I'm bothered. But more importantly is the disgruntlement of the unionist or loyalist parties in Northern Ireland. And these are the people in Northern Ireland who want to remain part of the United Kingdom. The Northern Ireland Executive has stopped. That's if you like, the local government in Northern Ireland. And there's going to be an election in May coming up. And it's quite possible that Sinn Féin could become the majority party in Northern Ireland, which would be a remarkable turn of events. And I've just noted here that pressure on Johnson was alleviated by the war in Ukraine. It's remarkable. The man has 10 or 12 lives because now he can act the statesman by visiting, and he did visit Kyiv. So what is the big green elephant in the room? So the cover of The Economist 2021, a united Ireland. And on the right, the New York Times, the week of St. Patrick's Day this year, Irish unity in our time. And remarkably, very soon after the 2016 referendum, Gerry Adams had an op-ed in the New York Times, and Gerry Adams was the president of Sinn Féin, always said he was never a member of the IRA during the Troubles, but nobody believes that. Adams just says, I wasn't, and you have to prove I was if you want to do anything about it. But he had a remarkably prescient op-ed in which he said, Brexit will lead to a united Ireland. And I remember reading this and thinking, Gerry, what are you smoking? No way. There won't be a united Ireland in my lifetime, possibly even in my daughter's lifetime. Well, Gerry is a very smart individual, and basically the idea of leveraging the majority Remain vote in Northern Ireland to bring about a united Ireland. Because as I said, although the majority of individuals in Northern Ireland don't want to join the Republic in a united Ireland, although that majority is getting smaller every year, the majority want to remain in Europe. Now, if you get a bunch of young people who really don't remember the Troubles and really don't care about being British or being Irish, they want to be European, then that could swing the vote. And the vote on a united Ireland would result if if they held a referendum in Northern Ireland and 50% plus one person said we want to leave the United Kingdom, then there would have to be a vote in the Republic to accept Northern Ireland, and that would be it. And that's something I'll come back to later. However, at 6:35, we have to do a little Irish history because I really want to explain the historical context of why this all matters. So at the moment in Ireland, they're going through what they're calling the decade of Centenary Commemorations. So 100 years since a series of very important events between 1913 and 1923, starting out with the arming and militarization of Ireland in 1913, the beginnings of militant Irish republicanism, the 1916 rebellion, of course, the very famous Easter Rebellion, Easter Monday, 106 years ago last Monday. A general election in 1918 provided a mandate. So Sinn Féin at that time had formed as a party, and they won the majority of seats in Ireland. And remember, of course, back then, if you won a seat in Ireland, it was for the Parliament in London. There was no local Parliament in Dublin. You went to London. 1919, there was the establishment of the Irish Parliament, Dáil Éireann, illegally, and the start of the War of Independence on January 21st, 1919. Two very important events. The third important event on that day I like to mention was my dad was born. 1921, a year to remember, to say the least. So the establishment of the Northern Ireland state, the partition of Ireland, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which brought an end to 2 years of rebellion, and the establishment of what was called the Irish Free State, Saor Stat na hÉireann. There was then, unfortunately, a 9-month civil war between the guys and gals who had fought against the British because they fell out over the details of the treaty. And I don't have time to get into that in too much detail. Part of it was the retention of an oath of allegiance to the King of England. Ireland was remaining within the Commonwealth. And ironically, the formation of Northern Ireland as a partition, but it wasn't the key issue at the time, because frankly, I think everybody in Ireland thought the border would go away and there'd be a united Ireland in no time anyway. The Civil War lasted 9 months. It's a very vicious event. If you Google it, you'll see a lot going on in Ireland now too. Trying to imagine how to commemorate it. It's hard to commemorate a civil war. And of course, you had a civil war in this country, and many, many, many more people were killed in this civil war than in Ireland. But proportionately, there was a lot killed in Ireland at the time, and a lot of dreadful things done. So basically, there's two approaches to Irish independence in the late 19th century, early 20th century. A parliamentary constitutional approach, which would have put Ireland as independent within the British Empire, and then the militant rebellion. So that's two aspects. And this first one finally died because Britain kept postponing the possibility of even putting a parliament back in Dublin, a local parliament. It had been removed in 1801 with the Act of Union because of the 1798 rebellion. A whole other set of slides we'll talk about someday. But the other thing to remember is there's two traditions within Ireland and within Northern Ireland, both based on the idea of blood sacrifices. One is from the Unionist Loyalist side, and it revolves around the 36th Ulster Regiment at the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916, when they fought in Europe against the Germans for King and Country, and then the Easter Rebellion, April 25th, a nationalist. So these two, and this is it's a poster from a train station, or I think representing an Ulster soldier from the 36th Ulster Division looking out over the Battle of the Somme. And then this is Dublin in after Easter week 1916, the center of the city thoroughly bombed. This was the proclamation read on Easter Monday morning by Patrick Pearse outside the General Post Office. Those of you who've been in the centre of Dublin, it's still working as a post office. There are about, I don't know, 6 or 8 huge Doric columns in front, and if you look closely, you can see chips where bullets hit the pillars. Coming out of after 1916, there was a war of independence, as I said. This is an image of the Anglo-Irish Treaty being negotiated, the British on one side, the Irish delegation on the other. I think this is yes, you can see here, this is the New York Times headline, Ireland to be free state within the British Empire. Agreement signed giving her a status like Canada's. And that was on in December of December 6, 1921. And I always like this quote. Lord Birkenhead said after the negotiation, I have signed my political death warrant. And Michael Collins, who's right there, who was one of the negotiators and was the head of the IRA's intelligence wing, said, I have signed my actual death warrant. And sadly, he was actually killed during the subsequent Civil War in August of 1922. That'll be a big commemoration in Ireland coming up. I'd be interested to see if the New York Times covers that one, because Collins was quite the hero. And then I mentioned about the Civil War ending. So what happened after we got our independence? So Ireland became a post-colonial country. It was economically very dependent on Britain, and the other important aspect of Ireland was the influence and power of the Catholic Church. Massive emigration from Ireland all through the 20th century. You think of emigration during the potato famine and earlier in the late 1700s. The emigration in Ireland in the 30s, 40s, 50s, mostly because the country was an economic basket case. This man here on the left, this is Eamon de Valera, then at that stage president of Ireland. He was the one surviving commandant in 1916, and he missed getting executed because all the other leaders of the rebellion, 15 of them were executed. He missed it. They say because he was actually an American citizen, but also I think they just hadn't got around to him when the British realized they should stop shooting Irishmen because it turned the mood of Ireland completely around. But this man here, I think, is more important, Donogh O'Malley. He was the Minister for Education, and in 1966, he introduced free education for high school. Up to that point, something like 80% of kids attending middle school would leave schooling at the age of 14. And how do you build an economy based on that level of poor education? And the story goes, it's actually covered in O'Toole's book, that O'Malley was so upset by what he was seeing as Minister for Education that he unilaterally announced it at a meeting with journalists around that there was going to be free education, and apparently he got thoroughly beaten up by his leader of the party, and especially by the Minister for Finance, who had to then find the finance for it. And of course they did find the finance. They stopped spending it on other stupid stuff, and it got spent on education. And I personally think I benefited from that, because I'm not sure I would have made it to high school without that benefit. My parents didn't have the wherewithal to pay the fees that were required for going to a secondary school or high school. In 1973, Ireland joined the European Economic Community with Britain, but I have this down as the bleak 1980s, and this slide shows the unemployment rate here very high in the late 1980s, and then precipitously dropping in the mid 1990s. There was also this phenomenon of green card fever in the mid 1980s, when I think the State Department decided there were enough illegal Irish arriving in Boston and New York. We better just give them some green cards, and at least we have them on the books. And I got one of those. A Congressman Donnelly from New England, Massachusetts, I think, or Connecticut, did work on that. Bit of a hero, in my opinion. So this slide just shows a couple of major changes in the Republic of Ireland over this 100 years. I think this one is interesting. It shows the deaths by age group between 1916 is the purple and 2014 in the green. And so, for instance, if you look down here, under the age of 1, in 1916, you had that number of deaths, which is 5,500. In 2014, you have that number. This is the way it should be, and that's the way it is now. And here we have the majority of people dying at 85 and over. We still got the bit in the middle, but it speaks to the high incidence of infant mortality in Ireland in the first 20 or 30 years of independence. This shows us, this slide is a destination of Republic of Ireland's goods exports as a percent of total. This is exporting to the United Kingdom, and you can see it's quite high up to about 1955, 1960, and then it drops, and the red is North America, takes off, and the rest of the world. And this is a slide showing, it's based on a survey of who thinks they benefited from membership of the European Union. And the dark is greater than 85% of the public polled in this thought that their country benefited from a membership of the European Union. And I don't think Ireland could be dark enough. In fact, it says 95%. And that's testament to how well Ireland did by being a member of the European Union. I remember going back on vacation to Ireland in the 1990s when there was a tremendous building boom and highway boom in Ireland. So you go to Ireland now and drive from Dublin to Galway or down to Kerry, you drive on pretty nice highways. Mind you, when you get to Kerry, you got to go the back roads, but we'd like to keep the back roads down there. But a lot of the funding for those major highway infrastructure came from the European Union. Ireland owes the European Union a lot. And I like to think that perhaps it's being paid back a little in the Brexit debate. I'll explain why. The fall of the Catholic Church is remarkable to read about this and to learn about it. The Catholic Church, Ireland effectively, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say it was a theocracy for much of the 20th century. One particularly dreadful example of this, there's a New York Times special report published in 2017, The Lost Children of Tuam. Tuam is a town in County Galway where there was a home for unwed mothers and orphan children. And this rather striking photo of some of the little kids. I think in about 5 or 6 years ago, there was something like 800 skeletons discovered in a pit in the grounds of what had been the home. It's now a small garden with houses all around, built residential. But back in, I think, the 1970s, some kids discovered this, reported it to their parents, who told the police, who did nothing about it. But testament to how Ireland has changed. When it was rediscovered a couple of years ago, there was more done about it. And these were children who died in care. Probably, I don't think there's any sense that they were murdered other than through neglect. But the remarkable thing was that they weren't given a Christian burial in a cemetery. And just a shocking indictment of, in my opinion, the failures of Mother Church. This is the so-called Magdalene laundries were laundries that were established basically for fallen women. There's actually a movie version of this, which is pretty strong stuff, but well worth seeing, by Ken Loach. I think it's called The Magdalene Sisters. But this is Ireland's last Magdalene laundry, will become a memorial. This is in the middle of Dublin. This was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. And this graph shows population who report no religion in the Republic of Ireland census between 1961 and 2016. 1961, 2016, and that's 19% of those asked reported no religion. Unheard of. And this speaks to the changes that have happened. Whether you agree or disagree with it, the fact is that they've happened, and it's for a reason. So this is the book I wanted to plug, Fintan O'Toole's We Don't Know Ourselves. It got some pretty good reviews in, this is in the New Yorker, and this one was in the Atlantic. I like the subtitle of the How Does a Nation Emerge from Theocracy? Ask the Irish. And this one was How Ireland Blundered into the Modern World. And this is from the Irish Times, a sharp eyewitness to Ireland's evolution, a book well worth reading, I think. I need to cover a little about the Troubles. 1968 to 1998 began as civil unrest in 68. It escalated. I don't have time to go into too much detail. The pictures tell the story. British soldiers on the streets of Belfast, rioting, the infamous Bloody Sunday, January 31st, 1972, when paratroop soldiers fired on unarmed civilians, many of them shot in the back. I think it was 14 killed, and denial all through the decades until very recently when they finally acknowledged that that happened. The good news was the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which ended the Troubles, and it actually resulted in a change in the Irish Constitution in which we, and I don't know the wording off the top of my head, but we reduced our claim on Northern Ireland until the majority in Northern Ireland were willing to become part of a united Ireland. There was and that took a bit of work to get people to agree to that, and that's the New York Times. Heading Irish voters North and South give resounding yes to peace, which is really was remarkable. The vote in both North and South. But there are leftovers of the Troubles, and this is the part that worries me. So these are murals in a loyalist or Protestant neighborhood. I actually don't like the Catholic Protestant monikers because I think it's too simplistic. There have been Protestants in Irish history who fought for Irish independence, Wolfe Tone being one. I prefer nationalist or loyalist or Republican or loyalist. It's about identity rather than religion. And this is a mural on a wall commemorating the Irish 1916. These peace walls, so-called peace walls, were constructed during the Troubles. They're still there, and communities are still divided. I think it's a little bit like the Balkans. They finally got to peace, but there's still problems. And you know, Croatia and those countries are quite likely to blow up again because there's no resolution of what happened. And this is from the New York Times. Bloody Sunday's wounds are slow to heal. This was from last January, the 50th anniversary. So some of the issues are breakaway Republican elements, and there was the tragic killing of a journalist in 2019 during some rioting. She was shot. I don't think anybody was trying to shoot her. She just happened to be in the way of a flying bullet, which was really tragic because she was just there trying to report on what was happening. Loyalist paramilitaries target visiting Southern politicians, and I'll come back to that. Very recently, an episode where the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs was visiting Northern Ireland and had to be rushed away. And also we need to remember, and this was covered in a New York Times article in 2019, a very high incidence of suicide from PTSD in Northern Ireland. And that again, I think still hasn't been. Also unresolved issues. This was the killing of a group of Protestant workers traveling to work early in the morning. They were all made to stand out of the van. The Catholics were identified and taken off to one side, and the other men were shot to death. The Netflix movie, if you haven't seen it, the Netflix documentary remastered, The Miami Show Band Massacre, is fascinating. I don't have time to go into the detail, but a music group traveling from the north back to the south were intercepted by armed men. There was a bomb put in their van, but it exploded prematurely. And they were all killed except that guy there, and I forget which is the other guy who survived. And this guy here now, Stephen Travers, has basically good evidence that those men who stopped them that night were loyalists in collusion with the British Army and probably with the British government. And he's taken the British government and the Ministry of Defence to court and succeeded. This is actually a bomb in Dublin in 1972 on the side wall of Trinity. So the next time you're in Dublin and you walk out of the Kilkenny Design Centre, having made your Visa card a lot lighter or heavier perhaps, it's right there across the road. There were 3 bombs set off on a May Friday. I was actually a 14-year-old stepping onto a train when I heard the bombs go off. That's the closest I came to it. This, I think, was the bomb in Oma in the mid-1990s. So the end of history is a nod to Francis Fukuyama's comment about the end of history at the end of the Cold War, and has Ireland entered. So Ireland became a post-colonial country with the Celtic Tiger, huge foreign investment, favorable tax laws, a young, well-educated English-speaking population within Europe. And this slide shows immigrants decreasing and immigrants increasing 2019, 2018, 2016. So a dramatic turnaround of what happened for most of the 20th century. Societal liberalization in Ireland. I've already spoken a bit about the end of church control. Immigration and diversification. When I was a kid, I think there was one black kid in my town. Now you walk around Dublin and you'll see a lot of ethnic variation, and they'll all have Dublin accents. So they were born and raised in Dublin. Gay rights and same-sex marriage. I think Ireland was the first country to vote by referendum to legalize same-sex marriage. And the not the prime minister, but the co-prime minister, we call him the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, not only was his father Indian, which is unheard of, that somebody of with a foreign father would become that high in government in Ireland, but he's also gay. Abortion, there was an amendment to repeal the abortion. And then, of course, the visit by Queen Elizabeth II in 2011, remarkable event. And the wily old Queen was very clever. Having arrived in Ireland and having paid her respects to the president, she went immediately to the, basically to, it's called the Garden of Remembrance in Dublin, and laid a wreath at the memorial to the guys killed, executed by her government in 1916. And she really won over a vast majority of the Irish in that visit. And then the other thing is just to remind you about the rise of the Greens and other political parties, particularly Sinn Féin. So a lot of changes in Ireland. I don't really have time to go into this other than Ireland's diplomatic influence, which is very well covered in The Economist about a year ago. And these are the factors that lead to it. The Irish-American card. The Economist's comment was that the EU's position on Brexit is shaped by diplomats and by Irish diplomats to a large extent. Let me just keep going. This is the episode I was telling you about, the Irish foreign minister at a meeting in Belfast, getting the word that we have to vacate the building. There's been a bomb scare, and this was the police outside. This is a slide showing a poll, I think a couple of years ago, no, in 2020, yes. If there were a border poll, what would you prefer timing for this be? So first of all, 47% said they would remain within the United Kingdom, 45% voted for United Ireland, but it's probably something like 8% don't know. So that's oscillating, and you probably, if you did a poll every month, you'd probably get very different numbers, all around a 7 or 8 or 10% range. This is significant. This bar shows 5 years. 35% thought there would be a United Ireland or a referendum within 5 years. So this is the this highlights the importance of the Irish American vote. Joe Biden is staunchly pro-Ireland, as are many Irish American politicians. And this will be important, I think, for when the issue of United Ireland comes up, because I think Ireland is going to need a lot of help from Europe and from America to help maintain the status quo. And then the other issue is the issue of future UK-US trade. And Biden has already told Boris Johnson in words of one syllable that don't mess with Ireland or you'll have difficulty doing trade. Now, I know Joe Biden doesn't determine trade in the United States, but he certainly can influence it. And this is Chris Murphy, and this is Simon Coveney, the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs. Great catching up with my friend, Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney at the Munich Security Conference. And this is the Irish Prime Minister, Micheál Martin, talking to Joe Biden. Best of friends. And at that, so my concern, so I was raised in an Ireland where we all hoped and dreamed and prayed and whatever for a united Ireland. And I'd still like to see a united Ireland. My concern is that Brexit has brought the likelihood of a united Ireland very fast forward. Ireland has, especially in Northern Ireland, they've not really got over all the hurt and pain that happened during that 30 years of the war. And that tomorrow, if there was a vote and 50% plus one person voted to leave the United Kingdom, and in the Republic, they voted to welcome them in, you'd have a united Ireland. You'd have 800,000 people in the Northeast who wouldn't like it. And my concern is that even if 10% or less of them said, you know what, this is how the IRA got to this point by 30 years of war. We will prosecute 30 years of war on the Republic of Ireland on this new unit called the United Ireland. And we do not want to go back to trouble. And I certainly don't want to have to wonder the next time I go to Ireland, is it safe to walk down the street in Dublin or Cork or wherever. I'm going to leave you with this image of Jim Larkin, a famous socialist, actually, and he actually spent some time in Sing Sing prison for his socialist activities in the US, and a famous speech he made in Dublin, I think during the 1913 lockout. And this is the statue in front of the General Post Office. And it says, he's reported to have said, the great appear great because we are on our knees, let us rise. And we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions.
Just stop the screen share so
Oh,
we can
sure.
see the other notes.
Yep.
Will we be receiving a copy of
The recording? Yes. Oh, the slides?
yeah, the slides?
I can
Slides if you like. Yeah, give me a email.
Okay.
Okay.
Just want to see if.
Question, yes, Deborah.
Yeah, I wondered, because you were talking about how religion is much less important as well.
I can repeat that question. Go ahead. Yeah.
Since
Yes.
the
Yep,
younger
yep.
generations are less religiously connected, do you think that would mean it's easier for the northern and the rest of the republic to meet on the same, the young people don't care, really?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point. In fact, I used to have on these slides a tweet I saw, and it was somebody had taken a tour around Belfast in a taxi, one of the black taxis, and they said to the taxi driver, so what about the Troubles? Will the Troubles come back again? And the taxi driver, and I can't do a Belfast accent, but said, no, the young people, they're just, let me get this right. They're just interested in TikTok and they're all gay anyway. So I guess if you're interested in TikTok and you're gay, you're not going to create any trouble. But it was a reflection of his perception of the taxi driver of how the place had changed. So the point is that's why I don't think religion is the issue. The issue is national identity. So you could have people in Northern Ireland who are ostensibly from a Protestant neighborhood and have a history of coming from a Protestant family background, who may or may not be religious or practice religion, but they're staunchly pro the United Kingdom, and they want Northern Ireland to remain within the United Kingdom. And like I said, it's about 800,000 people of that demographic group in Northern Ireland. And even if 1% were to say, I'm going to take up arms to prevent this United Ireland, that would be 8,000 people. And the Irish security forces would be hard pressed to control 8,000 armed rebels.
It never really was about religion anyway. It was political.
It was political. It was identity.
The religion
Yeah.
has nothing to do with
Yeah,
it.
and as like in many issues like religion is used by people to drum up issues. But frankly, yeah, exactly. It's really about identity. Yes, Jim.
Yeah, but if you talk about identity, and you look at the history of the Unionists since 1921, it's not an identity I'd want to brag about. Plus the fact that the Unionists, at least the DUP and UVF, are not sure who, but there's more violence being created in the North now, leading up to this election.
Yep.
And then also the DUP has come out, at least, what's his name? I think his name, but said that even if the voting body elects Sinn Féin, that they won't sit in the executive, which means there'll be no executive.
Right.
So democracy doesn't mean a damn thing. And, so I'm not sure it's as rosy.
No, it's not. I totally agree with you. The DUP, by the way, is the Democratic Unionist Party. It was a party formed in the early 70s by an infamous firebrand. He was actually a minister, Ian Paisley. I think his son is also involved, but there's other people. The other interesting thing about some, and this is, I'm not making this up, folks, believe me, some of them have rather interesting views about the age of the earth, as in 1,000 years old or 5,000 years old. So it is an interesting mix of religion and politics. But yeah, I think they realize their days are numbered. They see a united Ireland coming on the horizon.
Yeah.
And they're damned if they're going to allow you go down easily on that. Now, if you sort of stand over here and try to imagine what that's like, in a way, I understand it. They've had 100 years of their own stateless. I think they mismanaged it. If they had been a little more understanding of Catholics / nationalists over the decades, the trouble, so I always like to remind people, the trouble started in 1968, but it actually started as a civil rights movement. The IRA had 10 guns in the north of Ireland at the time. It started as a civil rights movement, mirrored on the civil rights movement in this country. And in fact, there's plenty of video on YouTube and where else of people marching arm in arm, singing "We Shall Overcome," as in Martin Luther King and the movement in this country. And then it just fell apart. And some people thought the IRA...
It really didn't fall apart. It was greeted by the police and the army,
Yes,
with batons and
absolutely.
violence.
Yeah.
So it was defeated more than it fell apart.
True. When I say the effort, it wasn't the effort to do that fell apart because of the response of the police force at the time in Northern Ireland. The B Specials and the Royal Ulster Constabulary were 95% Protestant, and the story goes that when they were at work they were in their uniforms patrolling the streets, and when they were off work in their civvies, they were out patrolling the streets, doing the same job. And then, of course, the British government realized that a corner of the United Kingdom was essentially at war, so they had to do so. What does a government like the British government do? They send in troops. And so they sent British soldiers over, and British soldiers with English accents arriving on Irish soil again
was like a red rag to a bull. And then, of course, Bloody Sunday happened, and
That's what prompted the IRA to get going.
and that's what that was the greatest. I think I've seen Martin McGuinness, one of the leaders of the IRA, saying the greatest recruiting tool ever was Bloody Sunday. Sadly, 14 innocent people had to die, but thousands of young men joined, and then the thing all, yeah. But it did start as a civil rights movement, but it was then prosecuted as a very effective war. And in fact, there's some question as to why the IRA even agreed to give up. And I think the point was, I think in the end, they realized they were going to send another young generation, in some cases their grandchildren or children, into another, so they had to just say, we'll see what we can get. But from a unionist or a loyalist perspective, they look at this and they say, but they got this far with violence. Well, we'll do the same thing. And that is my concern, because I don't think the Irish government will be able to manage that issue. And it will be interesting to see, will there be German peacekeeping troops or American peacekeeping troops on the streets of Dublin and Belfast someday? If you think that that's fabulous thinking, let me assure you, there is nothing fabulous about anything anymore. Anything. Would we have thought that the Russians would invade Ukraine? I mean, anything can happen. You've got to be ready for it. And yeah.
But in a way, that's really a threat that's being imposed, from what I can gather, from what I read, be a threat. Because again, the DUP and that group, the council,
right,
are trying to get the Protestants or Unionists not to vote for Sinn Féin or any Catholic organization or nationalist. And so there's a question, if they're already starting the violence, we said before, but if they start a war, there's a lot of the, from what I gather, a lot of Protestants in the North are also fed up with wars.
Of course.
And so I question whether that's a veiled threat but I'm sure with the thinking from what I read that something is going to would happen rather.
Yeah, I think it will happen, and I think you're right. I think it is partly a threat, and hoping that they can stop the thing happening. And I don't know how to deal with that except try to marginalize the crazy people. But there's a lot of crazy people. So what I want to do is I want to try to have the United States and the Europeans make a plan, and I think that's really what's happening at a diplomatic level between the Irish and frankly the British government. They'll be well shut of north of Ireland. I'm sure they'd be happy to be gone. But they do feel, at least some of them are decent people, and they feel some obligation to make sure that things work out well. But the Irish government are definitely going to have to, and hopefully the Europeans, the European Union will step up and help. And this didn't happen. There was some talk back, I remember back in the late 60s, especially, about a United Nations force coming into Northern Ireland. But at that time, nobody was going to cross Britain. And Britain said, this is an internal matter, we'll take care of it. That day is over now. That was the line I used. The border has been Europeanized. Europeans are now much more aware of, and in fact, maybe that's one good thing about Brexit, that it has made Europeans aware of what's happening, and hopefully Americans too. Young lady, yes.
We talked a little bit about how the inter-Ireland trade is on the uptick. Is it theorized that it's going to continue to grow at the same pace, or is it sort of taken to one step and we think that's it?
Anything I've read would indicate that it's increasing and it's maintaining, and part of the reason is because of there is a word I could use, but I won't, cluster something about how Brexit has been executed, because the British have not done a very good job of trying to manage trade between Britain and Europe and the rest of the world. And this is, of course, as I sometimes say, I don't care if the British Prime Minister decides to shoot himself in the foot, but if the bullet ricochets and hits Ireland, then I do care. And so they brought this on themselves, and so they can deal with it. But now I think they're realizing that this was maybe not such a great idea. Some people in Britain, many probably, because they're realizing the economic implications. But to answer your question, I don't know for definite. It appears from what I've seen and read that economic boost between Northern Ireland and Ireland is a real thing, and it's a real concern because it further connects Northern Ireland to Ireland and separates Northern Ireland from Britain, and this must be driving some of those people in Northern Ireland through the roof. They must be driving them insane to think that they're being, and of course, and the reason I highlighted the changes in Ireland, because always the argument about joining the Republic of Ireland was an economic basket case run by the Catholic Church. No longer the case. So they can no longer argue that joining the Republic of Ireland is a bad idea on those two parameters. The only one left is nationalism, national identity. And I don't know if they're going to get over that, maybe. Yes, ma'am.
So if there is reunification, does that affect Brexit? I mean, does it trigger anything in Brexit that?
I don't think so, because the British have always said, and it's in the Good Friday Agreement, that as soon as the majority in the north of Ireland vote to leave, so then it'll actually be Great Britain. There'll be no more United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was established in 1801. It was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Then it became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Then it'll be the United Kingdom of Great Britain and the Isle of Man, or if you want to pick an offshore island, but that's all that'll be left. And then I haven't even mentioned about Scotland. I mean, that's a whole other. They also voted to remain in Europe. Now, interestingly, they have had a referendum and it was defeated, but that could change. So you could see the disintegration of Great Britain. I actually think that there are probably quite a few English people who are effectively English nationalists who really don't care much for the Scots, and the Welsh. Really, is that even a place? It's not. It's a principality. Hence, you've got the Prince of Wales. But I think there are a lot of people especially in small town, middle-sized town, rural Britain, England, who would be quite happy to have England go it alone. And that was one of the cards used in Brexit. This idea of England standing up on its own and shrugging off, the European Union, like it was some kind of a burden on them. But
So England could become the declining economic
I
power.
couldn't possibly comment. Yes, sir.
A couple of years ago, I read that something like between 60 and 70% of all the people employed in Northern Ireland were public servants or government officials. With that in mind, I can quite understand the Irish saying, we don't want Northern Ireland, we can't afford it, because their economy wouldn't support all these people. So if it happened, there'd be a lot of these people who would lose their jobs.
Right.
And then we'd have a huge big economic problem in Northern Ireland.
And if they had joined the Republic of Ireland, it would be a huge big economic problem in the Republic of Ireland.
Yes.
The parallel, I guess, is East Germany joining with West Germany at the end of the Cold War. And that was a great burden on West Germany to incorporate East Germany. The difference is that the West German economy, relative to the Irish economy, but I would say the hope is that, I mean, the Irish economy when I was growing up was basically Ireland was an agrarian country. There were a few factories. Actually, in my hometown, there was a Dutch company, Douwe Egberts. They made cigarettes, I think, of all things. They must have imported, I don't know, but it was a nice big factory on the edge of town, gave a lot of employment. The Irish economy was a basket case. And then in the 1990s, in the 1980s, it was starting. And a lot of it was embracing foreign investment, American companies. If you're now, when I was in college in the mid-70s, in the center of Dublin, down, so the River Liffey runs through the center of Dublin. As you go east towards the mouth of the Liffey, what's called the old dockland, the docks, you would not walk down there on a Saturday afternoon, and certainly not a Saturday night. It was cowboy land. That is now all gleaming glass and steel. Google, Facebook, a huge number of companies, huge amount of foreign investment. Of course, the Irish were very clever in how they did it. They offered very nice tax breaks for foreign investment and convinced the European Union that they should let them do that. And I think it was last year, they had to reverse some of that and increase it. But still, it was a remarkable turnaround. Now, part of, I would argue, and O'Toole covers it in his book, part of the reason that happened was because Donogh O'Malley introduced free high school education, and the Irish became educated, and a lot stayed and some left. But now you had a very well-educated youth, English speaking, on the edge of Europe, but most importantly, integrated into Europe through the European Union. So it's possible the same could happen in Belfast. I mean, I would say Northern Irish people are a pretty industrious bunch. And they built the Titanic, but that was more about sailing in the wrong part of the ocean. But the shipbuilding in Northern Ireland, the linen industry, very capable. I think I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's a fact. The huge amount of subvention, it's called, money that travels from London to Northern Ireland to maintain the economy, hundreds of millions of pounds every year. And it is tragic to think that the majority of the employed are civil servants. That's where I think it'll be important if and when this United Ireland comes, that America, through the Irish American lobby, thank you very much, sir, and European Union invest in Ireland, both in terms of economic development for Northern Ireland and frankly, security as well. I think it's going to be an issue. Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that Russian misinformation influenced the Brexit vote?
Oh, I don't know, because it was around that time, wasn't it? 2016. You know, I don't think I've come across that. Do you know?
It was mentioned in the Russia article that we read.
Was it? Yeah, you're right. It was. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm not sure how. I think if it was, it probably wasn't a deciding factor. There's actually a very interesting, and I'm not going to remember the name of it. It's a TV show, might be on Netflix. I think it's called Brexit, the Uncivil War, and it has Benedict Cumberbatch, you all know who he is, playing Dominic Cummings, who was the guy brought in by the Brexiteers to basically organize the vote. And Cummings came in, he then joined the Johnson administration, and then he was fired from that. And now takes every opportunity to poke at Boris Johnson. But he came in and I think that, I mean, it is fiction, but it's based on some amount of reality. What he did was he actually identified a large number, and does this sound familiar, of people who felt disenfranchised in England, who hadn't voted in 10 or 15 or 20 years, didn't vote Labour, didn't vote anything, and targeted them and brought them with him over the line and convinced them. I mean, the famous advertisement they ran in the English newspapers of showing, I think it was a photo taken somewhere of people lining up, maybe in Greece or Hungary, immigrants trying to get in, and it was portrayed as Turks invading Europe. And that basically, and the amusing comment running in Twitter was from the Turks, "You must be joking, go to England, it's cold, wet and miserable over there, we're quite happy where we are." But yeah, so I think it's, if it did happen, I think it was less of an issue than just the way the campaign was run, or very poorly run by David Cameron and the Remainers. I mean, they thought, piece of cake, this is silliness. And actually that bit is covered in the show as well. Yeah, it's well worth seeing. Yes, sir.
It hasn't been mentioned, but and I don't know the answer to this, but to what degree, if any, is the national identity of Northern Ireland have anything to do with Scottish ancestry, Presbyterian Church?
Yeah, I mean, they're basically Northern Ireland. The majority of loyalists or unionists are Scots Presbyterians.
Yeah.
They came from Scotland into Northern Ireland in the 17th century. Many of them then left and came to the US and went down the Appalachian Trail, and that's all the Scotch Irish in Kentucky and Tennessee. When I moved to Kentucky when did I move to Kentucky? In 1998, I would meet people and they'd say, "Oh, you're Irish. I'm Scotch Irish. Give me a hug, have a drink." And I'm thinking, well, you don't know your history very well, but never mind, I'll have a beer. And so, yeah, so they're Scots Presbyterians. And I think that speaks to, they're quite fundamentalist in their outlook, both in religion and maybe in politics, but they're very loyal. It's kind of interesting when you read about the psyche of those folks. They'd almost fight Britain to remain part of Britain. I mean, they're adamantly loyal, but they also have a self-identity as well. Like they almost see themselves, they don't see themselves as British. They're Northern Irish, as they say, but they're definitely not from the Papist South, even if the Pope is just an interesting character anymore. Yeah.
1914, they threatened to fight England.
Yes, they did. Yes, yeah. They were going to rebel when it looked like in 1912, 1913, 1914 that the British were going to give a certain amount of home rule, what they called home rule to Ireland, and return a parliament to Dublin. They armed themselves. That was the beginning of the militarization well, actually it was more like 1912, and the formation of the UVF, and they signed a pact in blood sort of thing that they were going to fight, because they thought they were going to lose their connection with Britain. And then of course the war intervened, and the British government had the opportunity to say, okay, we need to focus on the war, we'll get back to Ireland. But by then in 1914, 1915, there was the beginnings of a militant, well, it had always been in Ireland, but it became better organized, a militancy in Ireland. And then that's what happened in 1916. And although that rebellion was soundly defeated in 5 days and the leaders were all executed, it is definitely, my wife's American, and when we met first, she wanted to know, so is St. Patrick's Day like your Independence Day? Or, and I had to explain, well, no, actually it's a Saint's Day because of St. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland. We actually don't have an Independence Day in Ireland. And the reason we don't was because when we finally did get independence in 1922, it was blemished by leaving behind Northern Ireland. And I would actually argue that Easter Monday should be our Independence Day. Of course, then it would change. It's not a date. The day would change.
Well, in 1918, the Irish voted for independence and the British government just ignored the vote.
Of course they did.
And also, Ireland didn't really become free and independent until 1949. Which most people are not aware of.
In 1949, we became the Republic of Ireland. Yes, and actually that was because after independence, that's why it was called the Free State of Ireland, Saor Stat na HÉireann. And it was because we were still somewhat linked to the Commonwealth and to the Empire. I don't know, I forget exactly why we decided in 1949 just to unilaterally declare an Irish Republic. I think part of the reason was because there always had been a sense that we wouldn't call ourselves the Republic of Ireland until we were 32 counties, the whole island. But I guess in 1949 they figured, let's just do it. It actually happened on Easter Monday, I think. that year.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
In 1948-49,
Mm.
Ireland became independent.
Yeah.
And everybody said we're free and maybe things are going to be great.
Mm.
But what actually happened was the UK, Britain, still controlled the farm communities, businesses, pretty much everything in Ireland. The Irish people weren't really free. So they owned the farm. That's what you for the race courses and all that type of thing. It's only later on that things improved, and then of course to this point in time where the Celtic Tiger took over and we boomed as a
Right.
nation.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course the north of Ireland, you say it wasn't that industrious. That's partly the reason why Britain kept the north of Ireland.
Because of the
It
industry.
was highly industrial.
Yeah.
Ireland was turning out submarines, tanks for war,
Mm-hmm.
a huge amount of armament, and small shops where mom and pop shops came off of that. And it was very industrial. But Ireland never really got free until such time as
Well,
America started to invest.
Respectfully,
Definitely in 85.
I'm not sure that Ireland wasn't free in the 1930s and
Free.
40s.
Free by name only.
Well,
they
but it was
didn't-
run, but it was, the government was elected by people in the Republic of Ireland, in the south of Ireland, in the Free State.
Yes, I understand that. But I'm saying, not free in terms of that you didn't own anything. People with mass immigration.
I think we did own plenty, we did. There were parts of, there were estates and things still owned by.
Mass immigration.
Well, there was mass immigration, but that's, I frankly, to be honest, don't blame the British government for mass immigration
No.
from Ireland. That was poor economic planning on the part of the nascent Irish state.
Some of it, yes. But again, they still had the farms
Yes,
and they had to take them back by the Irish government through land.
right,
reform.
through land reform, that's
And
true,
the
yes,
Catholic Church ruled supreme,
yes.
and they had Devanira very much under their control.
Mhm.
So it wasn't a long struggle.
Oh, sure,
And I know because I went back and I came back again. But
you've seen changes,
I've seen both sides,
yeah.
and they've become very, very advanced.
79 to 85, we went back to that industrial, program that they had where.
Uh-huh,
Industrial development.
Yeah.
all right, oh, the industrial development of
Yeah.
We're
Ireland.
both from Dublin.
Oh, you are?
anyway, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that, okay. I could hear your accent, but you're.
I covered.
We should go.
Well, we'll take,
Yes.
we'll take
One
one
more
more
question,
question. I know
yes.
Paul will hang around if anybody wants to ask anything afterwards. Michael?
So you predict trouble if Northern Ireland votes to join the Republic of Ireland, 50% plus one vote. Maybe the answer is to wait for that vote to happen when it's more obviously 2/3 or 70% of the people in favor of it. And that could be many years down the road, but maybe that's the better choice than unify. I imagine there's strong pressure to unify, but.
Yeah.
the Olympic
And I think that's
Trouble.
what, I think that's what Brexit has done, ironically. It has accelerated the process. I think without Brexit, there wouldn't be the reason to think that this could happen anytime soon. I
Yeah.
think there would still be a lot of people on both sides of the border arguing for it.
Yeah.
But the momentum has really picked up since Brexit. And that's mainly because the majority in the north voted to remain. And the longer Brexit goes on being the cluster it is, the more those people will say, you know what? Let's go back to Europe. So we'll see. Listen, we better finish off. It's past 7:30. Thank you very much.
Again, that's great.
I just want to make one announcement.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. For those who might be interested,